Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being joined by Joseph Solis-Mullen of the Mises Institute and the Libertarian Institute. How are you tonight, Joseph?
I'm very well, thank you, Jose. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's been long overdue, to be honest, because we've appeared, I believe, like 2 or 3 times together on Henry Zamota's History podcast. And I've always viewed you as one of like the more authoritative voices in the non-interventionist sphere as far as China policy goes, because you don't really see that stuff these days because of the fact that like of the whole Trump America First movement has unfortunately infected otherwise rational people when it comes to foreign policy. And I think that you're like a voice of clarity in that respect. But before we start, tell my audience more about your background.
Sure. I went to the University of Illinois, got a graduate degree in political science, went to Missouri, got a graduate degree in economics, went to Liberty where I did my terminal degree in history. I teach history and political science at Spring Arbor University. I teach economics at Jackson College. I wrote for many years at the Mises Institute, as you said. I'm actually back writing at the Mises Institute. I sometimes chat with Ryan McMakin on the Radio Rothbard podcast, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. And then I write a weekly column every Thursday at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm also the Ralph Raico Fellow. And I've written a couple of books, The Fake China Threat and Its Very Real Danger, and then most recently, The National Debt and You, What It Is, How It Works, and Why It Matters, both published by the Libertarian Institute. So I check a lot of different boxes. I'm, of course, a non-interventionist in foreign policy, and I think that's probably why you and I see eye to eye on so many things. So,
Yes, absolutely. And let's just start. Why do you believe all the China talk is like a fake ultimately? Why do you see it as a fake China threat?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking to and what you mean when you say threat. And this is something that I dive into in the books, and it's something I've explored in, I believe I'm approaching something like 50 articles just addressing this specific topic outside of the book. And so just to give you an example, recently, this past week, the Washington Post accidentally said it out loud. They said China's growing power is a threat to U.S. To Washington's power in the South China Sea. And that's what it is. It's Washington's power many thousands of miles away from our shores. So, and this is something that Bob Woodward had written in one of his books. It was Tillerson, I believe, Rex Tillerson, during the first Trump administration. He provided the background of a conversation that was had where Trump was saying, so what is the issue? And Tillerson was saying, well, Mr. President, you have to understand that China poses a threat to total U.S. domination of the Indo-Pacific up to the very shores of China itself. So China's rise is a threat to attempted U.S. hegemony everywhere. It's not an actual threat to our well-being. It's certainly no threat to our security. However, Washington behaving as if it were a real threat to those things has seriously deleterious consequences for us here at home. There is no question that running the empire abroad requires forcing the empire on us here at home. Increased domestic surveillance, more state intervention in the economy, an erosion of civil liberties. All of these things are connected. And actually, Scott Horton, who I know you appreciate, he has a great chapter at the end of his book, Enough Already, where he talks about the police state at home. It's like a 25-page chapter where he goes into all the ways that having an interventionist foreign policy abroad negatively impacts our ability to be free and prosperous here at home. So,
one thing I've noticed in your articles, and honestly, I thought that when you said you were approaching close to 50, that was an undercount, because I almost have like the perception that you've reached close to 100 in like the 3-figure range when it comes
might be.
Yeah. But one thing I've really come to appreciate coming from a historical background is you note that U.S.-China relations, they've been kind of hostile beyond like before the Cold War. Like you've pointed this out that there have been maneuvers by foreign policy strategists in DC to achieve a hegemony in the Orient. What era do you think that began when they started making those inroads there?
Well, during the middle of the 19th century, so the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, northeastern blue blood commercial shipping, these sort of the leaders of the northeastern establishment, they were very tied into shipping and commercial interests. They wanted access to the growing China market. The United States did not have the military wherewithal to secure it themselves. And so they took part, along with the British and the French and the Russians, in carving out exceptions and exemptions for themselves and privileges for themselves during the later periods of the Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties, as it was unraveling. This culminates in the promulgation of the Hay Note. This was around 1900, where they explicitly outlined what was called the open door policy, meaning that the United States was going to insist on equal treatment for its business people, for its diplomats in China. That whoever was doing what in China, the United States had to have its way there. And this was one of the reasons that that hawks in D.C. pushed very hard to try and get Washington involved in a war with Imperial Japan, going all the way into the 1920s, very much in the early 1930s. Even during Teddy Roosevelt's time, going further back than that, they seized Hawaii, not because they feared China or Russia or Britain, but because they feared Imperial Japan taking it. And that this was a vital stop-off point on the way to the China market, which the China market has been this kind of interesting, alluring thing that goes all the way back to like early British industrialization, that if we could only capture that China market, if we could get each of them to buy, a square centimeter of Lancaster cloth, we'd all be rich. So it's interesting that you hear these same arguments repeated by American policymakers in the 1970s as they're trying to open China to American trade. But I digress. Really, then the United States is trying to, what I would say there is keep China open to its business interests. That's why they get into the fight with Japan that they get into there. And then in the aftermath of that, this all gets tied into the Second Sino-Japanese War and the internal civil war between the KMT and the CCP. So it all gets very complicated there. The United States did back the KMT. They lose. And then there's a policy debate within Washington about whether or not to just embrace communist China and try and use them against the Soviets. This is something that if you read, kind of general popular histories, you're kind of told that, yeah, Henry Kissinger had this brilliant idea that you could do this. It's not true. Very early on, even Dean Acheson, who I totally despise, but even he pointed out in a white paper the year they lost China, quote unquote, that, hey, maybe this isn't so bad because we can use them against the Russians, just like Tito in Eastern Europe is a problem for Stalin. So U.S. policy has been very forward looking towards China for 180 years now. And as Washington's ability to project its power increased, it took a more and more hands-on approach there, all the way, to the point that they prevented the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War. When Mao and the CCP sweep down from the north and Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT flee to Taiwan, it is only U.S. military intervention that prevents Mao and the CCP from finishing that war right there and then and ending the problem, which exists to this day. So,
What intervention did they use in that case?
Well, okay, so as the policy debate is happening about who lost China, does it matter? Do we abandon the KMT? Do we defend them? The war in Korea happens. And Truman, I'm sorry, getting a little ahead of myself, because Eisenhower does the same thing that Truman does later. Truman basically sails the fleet right into the Taiwan Strait and says, okay, separate you two. We're going to go deal with what's going on in Korea. Everybody freeze. Because initially, it wasn't until 1970 that Chiang Kai-shek officially gave up his mission to retake the mainland. This was something that caused Taiwan to be a thing of fixation in the mind of Mao Zedong. Initially, it wasn't clear in the 1930s, early 1940s, when you had Mao writing about what would constitute China, what would China look like. It wasn't clear that Taiwan would be included. Taiwan had always been in the Chinese sphere of influence, part of that sort of Sinosphere area, but it hadn't been officially incorporated until right around the time of the American Revolution. And then it had been ceded to Japan, and it hadn't been part of China for very long. So it wasn't clear. But the fact that Chiang Kai-shek was there and that he was saying, this is my base of operations, and with American help and with my allies in America, I am going to invade the mainland and retake it. So it wasn't for, oh gosh, what was that then? 25 years that he gave that up. No, okay, we're just going to govern Taiwan. And then it wasn't until quite a long time after that that they officially renounced their policy of, like, we are the only legitimate government of China, all of China, include like mainland China. The claim was that we, the government on Taiwan in Taipei, are the government of all of China. And it wasn't until the democratization in the 1980s and early in the 1990s that was kind of done away with. So, yes, that, and so several times when tensions would flare up in the strait, it was the United States that intervened. So Truman did it, Eisenhower did it. Those were the two really important ones, because then Mao went ahead and started destroying China with things like the Great Leap Forward, and then the Cultural Revolution. And then, of course, there was the opening. Then there was Kissinger going to China, Nixon going to China, and that really helped tamp down cross-strait problems, because Beijing realized, oh, wow, this is not the time to be rubbing Washington the wrong way, especially because Taipei had then, and still does to this day, have very, very strong support, especially among Republicans in Congress. So that's basically the history there.
With respect to Taiwan, what is the official policy in terms of its political status?
In Washington or on Taipei?
Yeah, in Washington. Is it treated as an independent nation, or is it technically part of China?
Okay, so in order to open with Beijing, which was Kissinger's #1 priority, Taiwan was the sticking point. And they had to work very, very hard to get a draft. So there are 3 communiques. There's 1, 2, 3 communiques that are the basis of relations between the United States and Beijing as the recognized government of China. And so the formula that they came up with was because Beijing was saying, look, Taiwan is a part of China. That is our position. Nixon was afraid of outright agreeing to that for domestic political reasons. And so the formula they came up with was, Kissinger said, the United States acknowledges China's position that Taiwan is part of China. And then in further communiques and in further discussions, they basically agreed that it was Washington's preference that the dispute between Taipei and Beijing be resolved peacefully, and that the United States had an interest in this being resolved peacefully. Beijing's policy is reunification, and that if Taipei were to declare its independence, that would be a red line, and that would trigger a military intervention on the part of Beijing. So no, Taiwan is not recognized by the United States as an independent country. It exists in a gray zone. It exists in a sort of limbo. And over time, the number of states who have switched their recognition from Taipei to Beijing has only increased. I believe now there's only a handful of states around the world that still recognize Taipei. and of course, Washington is not one of them. Washington recognizes Beijing as the legitimate government of China and acknowledges Beijing's position that Taiwan is a part of China. And the idea was that over time, Beijing and Taipei would work towards reunification, that economic ties would increase, and that there was a lot of shared, they're all Chinese, right? They're all ethnically Han Chinese. Obviously, there is a native population, but the leadership, at least until about 15, 20 years ago, was almost exclusively mainland Chinese. And so, but of course, this is not what has happened. The party, the KMT, the party who initially was sort of the pro-unification party, open to unification with Beijing, I'm talking like in the late 80s, early 90s, they lost out, especially among younger and educated voters, to the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, who are a much more, they like define themselves as Taiwanese, like not Chinese, and are very independence minded. Now, they've won the last few elections, and the most recent election, the president said essentially, look, we don't need to declare independence. We are independent, just de facto. We don't even need to declare it. And that obviously does not please Beijing to hear language like that, but there's been no change to their constitution. There's been no change in Washington in terms of recognition, but there's been this slow nibbling away. I'm sure you and your listeners are aware that Washington now has troops on Taiwan. Right as Trump was leaving office and Joe Biden was coming in, just a little blurb in the Washington Post. Oh yeah, by the way, the U.S. has 500 troops on Taiwan. That number has been increasing. Now, there was a testimony just the other day in Congress where I believe some admiral in the Indo-Pacific was saying we need to up that number, about 1,000. Arms sales have increased. The idea was that arms sales, this was, I believe, the second communique, or maybe it was the third one, that said over time, the United States' provisioning of defensive armaments to Taiwan will decrease over time. That's obviously not been the case, right? And they've even gone so far as to sell them things like submarines, which, are those defensive? They obviously have offensive capabilities. So it's a real mess. And of course, the Taiwanese government, they spend a good deal of money lobbying. When I say a good deal of money, $20 million, but $20 million can get you a lot of stuff. I mean, they're getting the Israel treatment now. In terms of the amount of arms that they get, the special financing deals that they get. So, I mean, $20 million might sound like a lot of money lobbying, and anyone who's interested in this can go look at the great work done by Ben Freeman, who's the unquestioned authority on this work, at the lobbying efforts by the Taiwanese government. I mean, it makes sense. If you want to maintain your autonomy, but you can't do it yourself, you don't want to do it yourself, $20 million will buy you billions of dollars worth of security. So that's kind of the situation that we're in.
With respect to the DPP you mentioned, are they the dominant force in Taiwanese politics, or is the KMT just pretty much irrelevant now?
Well, they're not irrelevant, and certainly they're not irrelevant in local elections. However, it's important to note that as the electorate's opinion, so for example, polls who ask someone, how do you identify? Do you identify as Chinese or Taiwanese? The number of people identifying as Taiwanese in the last 25 years has steadily increased. The number of people who identify as Chinese going down. The number of people who favor independence versus reunification, those lines are going in the same direction. And so to maintain their electoral relevance, the KMT, even though they are more pro-Beijing than the DPP by far, even they have moved away from any talk of reunification, especially after, Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong, because they sort of held that up as like, look, see, Hong Kong was reunified with Beijing and they have the one country, two systems thing, and that works just fine. And that could be like us. You don't hear any of that anymore. Whatever you may think about that, I mean, that is just the reality that is how it's perceived on Taiwan. The KMT exists to win elections. And if you want to win elections, you have to, fish where the fish are. And that's just kind of the reality of Taiwanese politics. So they're not irrelevant, but to be relevant, they've had to move closer and closer to what the DPP's positions are. And of course, this is, I maybe should have mentioned this in case listeners aren't familiar with this. Sorry, there's a mosquito flying around in here. Washington's policy for a long time has been strategic ambiguity. So this is the idea that because when the United States switched its recognition in the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter, so Richard Nixon began the process, and then he got impeached, and there was a bunch of mess there. Jimmy Carter comes into office and gets handed this policy. He finishes it off. They switch recognition, and there had been a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan that dated back to the 50s. Eisenhower had done that. Now, Republicans said, hey, we can't abandon Taiwan. We need some kind of agreement with them. And so the agreement that they came up with was, okay, we're going to sell them defensive arms, and we might intervene in the event of an attempt by the mainland to invade, to reconquer Taiwan. But then again, we might not. And the idea here was to make Beijing think we might, to keep them from doing it, but also to make Taipei think that maybe we wouldn't, because you don't want them to feel like they have a free pass to declare independence, because Washington will fight for our independence. But you also don't want the CCP to think, oh, well, we can just roll in and take Taiwan. And so it was this very dangerous sort of ambiguous policy. And actually, my article at the Institute today looked at a book written by Ted Galen Carpenter. It dates back to 2005, and it's called the Coming War with China, America's Coming War with China, the crisis that will come over Taiwan. And he's talking all about, like, look, there's these trends in Taiwan towards independence. There's these trends in Beijing where they're gaining more and more military capacity. They're more and more determined to finish up, the retaining of Chinese sovereignty. And Washington's policy is hopelessly ambiguous and going to cause a lot of problems. And it's only going to get worse as things go along. And of course, there have always been those in Washington who hated the policy of strategic ambiguity and who favored a move towards what's called strategic clarity. That is coming out and saying, no, we will fight for Taiwan. And you heard Joe Biden say that several times. And then, of course, the administration would, send out the press secretary to say, oh, no, what he really meant was not that. No, he said it like 5 times. And the Trump administration, under his administration, you had very high-level visits. Those were supposed to be off limits according to the terms of normalization. I mean, Nancy Pelosi went and visited Taiwan. There weren't supposed to be high-level meetings between U.S. government officials and the Taiwanese government. Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the House. She's the third-ranking member of the government. And this was completely contrary to the communiques. And so Beijing reacted how you might expect. And but part of the problem is that so much of this is just not known by the general public. And so the media, the corporate media, the legacy media, portrays these things that Beijing does as just these wild, unprovoked, just irrational things that they're doing, just omitting all the context. And I think this is in part just to kind of stimulate the sort of intellectual thought environment that you need in order to convince the American people to possibly be ready to go to war with Beijing over the fate of Taiwan. I was just reading the Wall Street Journal today, and just right in there, the Pentagon is saying, hey, Pentagon officials are quoted in the Wall Street Journal today saying, yeah, this little air-sea battle with the Houthis, that's kind of like, we think of this as like warm up for our war with China that we're going to have here.
I saw that as well.
Yeah, and it was just like, what? Does the average person reading this not like put down the paper and say, wait, what is the Pentagon saying? And also, didn't we just lose? Like, didn't the Houthis just win, basically? what on earth do they imagine is going to happen when they try and bring the carrier battle groups within several hundred miles of the Chinese coast, which is just stacked to the gills with missiles? Are we going to start bombing mainland China over the fate of Taiwan? Like, that seems to be what they're gearing up to do. If you look at the military buildup that the United States has been engaging in, especially on the northern islands of the Philippines archipelago, which is something that just sails right under the radar. It hardly ever gets mentioned, but the United States is building up an incredible capacity on the Philippines, particularly right across from the contested shoals in the South China Sea, and then right across from Taiwan. Like, I don't know. And there's no debate about this at all. If you remember, was it last year? Congress tried to stick something in the National Defense Authorization that just said, yeah, if the president decides to go to war for Taiwan, he can just do it. I don't know if you remember, that was Bob Menendez before he disgraced himself, or disgraced himself more than he had already disgraced.
Yeah, he's
himself.
An odious creature. Yes.
Yeah. But he was the one who had tried to stick that into the National Defense Authorization, which always passed.
I am not shocked. That guy is a mega hawk.
Yeah. So, and that's just wild to me. Like, that only got stripped out in committee. If that thing had come to the floor, the National Defense Authorization always passes. I mean, we were this close to just giving Joe Biden the or whoever was running the show there, the green light to just go fight China if it seemed like the thing to do. The idea being, well, we don't have time to debate in Congress about, fighting China. The president needs the authorization to act immediately. It's like, last time I checked, Taiwan is not part of the United States. And there are no vital interests there. I go to great lengths in my book trying to explain that. There's no benefit to the United States in fighting for Taiwan. So,
how much steam have been the efforts to declare independence for Taiwan been in Congress? Is that a movement that's growing in popularity among the DC ruling class?
Well, it's a minority opinion. It's like the Mike Pompeos, the real swamp creatures. People at the Hudson Institute. It's those people. There is a definite desire to view Taiwan as like a front line in the containment policy, but there's no real desire to try and push Taiwan to declare independence and deliberately provoke Beijing into some kind of military confrontation. I mean, that is wild and irresponsible. And even though Congress is wild and irresponsible, it would just be too obvious a thing to do, I think, and it would be very, very damaging to the world economy. And these people ultimately exist to get reelected. So yes, they do favor arms sales to Taiwan. They increasingly favor an explicit defense commitment to Taiwan, especially, it must be said, among the Republicans. The yellow peril stuff, it's very much in the Republican camp there. And there's a very tragic intersection here between Trump and his view of China and the neocons who just love war. So the old Bush establishment people and the Trump people, like, they see eye to eye on this for slightly different reasons. Trump doesn't have an ideological affinity for Taiwan because it's a democracy, and spreading democracy and protecting democracy is pivotal to his foreign policy vision. But it is pivotal to the vision of people at like the Hudson Institute, or CNAS or any of those places.
I've seen this dynamic. So Trump's views are more kind of like this weird pseudo Pat Buchananism when it comes to protectionism and immigration restriction. And that, like, some of those critiques, I'd argue they're valid in certain cases, but that energy is diverted to like militaristic stuff. It's co-opted and diverted into just straight up military hawkishness. You've seen this also in the US and the UK with the counter jihad movement, where they take the energy from populist people that are concerned about mass migration and the impact it may have on demographics. And then instead of talking about immigration, they shift the discussion to like why we have to be defending Israel or having a huge military presence in the Middle East. It's the ultimate bait and switch. That's what DC is really good at. And when you look at like even Congress too, the majority of people in Congress are not even like populists, like especially among Republicans. They're all like just rebranded neocons at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate, and I think it's because there is no real alternative, and I think the budget fight recently has been a wonderful example of that. Like, we have a shadow, not an actual choice. I mean, Republicans just favor maybe slightly less spending or spending in different directions.
Slightly lower deficit spending.
Yeah, maybe slightly, but then, you know, with all the tax cuts and stuff, you know, like it's basically a wash. And, you know, they favor fighting Iran first, whereas, you know, the Democrats want to fight Russia first, or, you know, they both want to fight for Israel. You know, how much do we want to fight for Taiwan? It's just arguing around the margins. There's no radically different.
No, there's not.
Voice.
No.
Like what a populist right, like what an old right would represent, an actual choice. There's not an actual choice. There are just slightly different shades of vanilla that you are offered. And I think the big beautiful bill thing, I hope this is a wake-up call to people. And it's not really the Republican voters who are the problem. A lot of them are totally opposed to what they see going on. But at the end of the day,
it's an elite issue.
It's an elite issue. And then the elites can turn around and say, well, if you don't vote for us, what are you going to do? Let the Democrats win?
Yeah.
And the Republican base is like, well, we do hate Democrats more. And then it just keeps going all the way to bankruptcy, which is where we're ultimately going, or default, or both.
I've seen that too on the left. Liberals, establishment liberals, I remember this too in 2024. They were like, they were just lecturing and hectoring pro-Palestine people, saying, hey, so you want Republicans to win if you don't support Biden? It's this stupid type of very like tabloid tier politics at the end of the day leads to like zero discussions about actual policy and just getting people engaged in these poo-poo pee-pee debates that are just slop, and then people just get polarized and end up voting for the same stuff over and over again. And it creates this artificial polarization that gets nothing done.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And when we look at what's going on, so one of the reasons that I think foreign policy is interesting from a public choice perspective is the United States exists in the most benign security environment in the history of world empire.
Yes.
And for that reason, Americans don't actually need to be that concerned with what goes on in the rest of the world, because they live in such a benign threat environment. If you live in Poland, or if you live in you know, Kuwait, or, you know, pick a place, pick any place, you live in a dangerous neighborhood. If you live in the United States, however, you have not seen a real dangerous threat environment in any of our lifetimes. It's been a century at least. And so you pay less attention. And when voters rank their priorities of like, foreign policy is barely ever in the top 10 when it comes time for election day. They're all focused on domestic concerns, and rightly so, because what happens in the rest of the world is largely irrelevant. The problem is that Washington's system is very open to influence peddling and buying influence. And so Washington, catering to different interest groups, some foreign, some domestic, usually kind of hand in glove. These all work well together. You know, Qatari money pouring into think tanks, U.S. arms manufacturers, you know, sending money or sending arms there. There's a nice symbiotic relationship there. And it's at the margins there. And the American people just, it's one of those things, it's concentrated benefits and very diffuse costs. So, you know, maybe it costs me $30 a month And like, $30 a month, am I going to go to Washington and form a pack and oppose these guys? All these things. And that's $30 a month. It's all of us, $30 a month. For Lockheed, it's, $20 million a day or whatever. They're going to fight tooth and nail to keep that. And they're going to have lobbyists in-house all the time doing these things. And it's a system that's grown up over time. It's something that has been gradually accumulated. And it's not easy. We've seen the effort recently to cut into some of this spending. And it's just, it's futile. I hate to say it, but it's totally futile, because the military budget, over $1 trillion, the interest, over $1 trillion, entitlements, multiple trillions of dollars. The idea that, cutting a few $1 billion here and there is going to change things is completely ridiculous. And continuing to run these deficits, what it does is these politicians, they don't want to pass the taxes to pay for the things that they want to do. And so what happens? Well, they just float more bond auctions, the Fed prints more money, and then you have a rising price level. So you get taxed in a hidden way. So you have $2 trillion that needs to be funded each year. The U.S. Treasury market is not as liquid as it was, and even those people who are buying are demanding much higher premiums than they were. I mean, the 30-year Treasury is reaching historic highs on its yield, and it's obvious. It's obvious why. The United States is approaching $40 trillion in debt, over 120% of its GDP, and the solution of the fiscally minded party in the United States is to add $4 trillion to the deficit over the next decade, which may not sound like much, except that we're already projected to have $2 trillion deficits for the next decade. And it's just wild to me that you have these promises like, don't worry, all this spending combined with these tax cuts is going to stimulate economic growth, and we're going to grow our way out of it. Don't worry. Now, look, I've been hearing this for 20 years. And so I'm ready for us to grow out of it. I thought we'd already have done it. Maybe if we do it one more time, it will happen. No, of course not, right? And I wrote a really funny article where I said, let's just play with some numbers here. Let's play with some numbers. What would it take for us to grow our way out of the debt? And it takes like ridiculous stuff. It takes like 20 years of surpluses plus 5% inflation and 5% annual inflation to like erode the value of the debt. It would take 20 straight years of like budget surpluses. And it's like, guys, this is never going to happen. We're going to default. We're basically defaulting every time we, print more money, although investors understand this. That's why you can buy inflation indexed treasuries for a premium. But no, it's wild to me that this is going on and that the American people are just sitting tight while inflation just completely destroys our way of life. I mean, I look at what they've done to the cost of a home, and it's just wild to me. Like, the median price of a home now is over $400,000 with interest rates around 7%. I mean, people aren't going to be able to buy a home like that. It's just crazy to me. Meanwhile, median income is still right around $62,000. And the most generous projection I've seen for what this new bill that they're passing is going to do for our take-home pay over the next decade is increase it by 1/100%. 1/100%. That's what this is going to do. Once you factor in inflation and everything else, it's just completely ridiculous. So I don't see a way out of it.
Yeah, me neither. I'm pretty much black-pilled, as they say, with regards to the whole spending situation. Now, to other conflict theaters, where do you see things going in Ukraine as far as the whole Russian incursion there goes?
Well, I know Trump came in saying that he wanted to facilitate a quick end to that. And of course, like any rational person, I thought, hey, great. Best of luck to you. The problem is he has very little leverage, frankly, over the Russians. He has very little leverage over the Russians. He has very little way to get them to the table. The idea that you're going to sanction them more. Look, the Biden administration already whipped out all the sanctions they could. These sanctions were the most extreme they've ever attempted. It didn't work. I know now Republicans and Democrats in the Senate are floating this idea of a bill that will put 500% tariffs on any state that buys Russian oil. I mean, I just think that's a recipe for complete disaster for the global economy, for us, for us as well. That's who I'm actually concerned with, but for the global economy, of which we are a part. And then on the Ukraine side, look, Trump could turn it off, but he's not going to, for a number of reasons. Number one being Trump, this is not Trump's war, and he doesn't want to be blamed for losing it. And there's no pressure on him politically to end it. There's no like intense, powerful voting bloc in the United States that's putting pressure on him to end this war. And he didn't start the war, and he's not going to end it on terms that make him look bad. And so the easiest, most obvious thing from a public choice perspective to do is just let it run on autopilot. So the weapons will keep going. Russia will continue to eke out, gains. They're fighting a pretty savage war of attrition. It's not very pleasant. And we're all just left hoping that things will remain below the nuclear threshold in terms of the Russians retaliating for some of the things that the Ukrainian government is doing. We saw that Merz recently said, oh yeah, restrictions on what the Ukrainians do with the weapons we give them. Yeah, we haven't been doing that in a while. So, they're striking wherever they want inside Russia. And we saw Ukraine target parts of the Russian nuclear triad this last week, which, oh my goodness. Like,
was that supplied by U.S. intelligence and all that? I imagine that has to be like,
I mean, we haven't heard yet. I mean, in 6 months, the New York Times is going to run some article.
That's the template.
Exclusive. Did you know that 6 months? And it was like, of course, how else would they have done this? They don't have the intelligence capabilities to do this. So yeah, I mean, the United States, it's now known they've been providing all the targeting data, which of course they were. How else could they have done it? There's no one else who has the capability to provide that targeting data to them. And so, yeah, it's very concerning. But as I said, for all the reasons that I listed, Trump is not going to put the pressure on Ukraine to end the war. And he doesn't have any way to actually get Putin to want to end the war, except on terms that Putin wants. And we saw how far apart these two sides are. I mean, the Russian proposals for ending the war and the Ukrainian proposals for ending the war, they're not close. They're not close at all. And so the most recent thing, I think this morning, Trump had just said, yeah, they might just need to fight a little more. And yeah, that's pretty much where we are. They probably will just need to fight more.
I've seen in some spaces, especially in the Republican Party, the energy sector people saying that the one way, like the one card Trump could play is by turning to the drill baby drill agenda, by opening up like as much like drilling as possible in the US, like fracking and all the works to effectively like tank global oil prices. How viable is that strategy? And would that take like several years to like even come into fruition?
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points there. Number one, it's not like there's some switch sitting in the White House where Trump just turns the switch and it's like, how do you like that? That's not how it works. First of all. Second of all, I think American energy companies are going to be loath to tank their own profit margins in the name of helping America's foreign policy. That's not how that works. It's typically the other way around. U.S. foreign policy should serve American corporate interests, not vice versa. Not saying that's always how it works out, but that's generally how those cards get played. So no, I don't think that's viable. No. And again, I just think it will continue to run the way that it has. And it's very tragic, very unfortunate. Of course, the war never needed to happen, but now we're here. Now we're years in, and it's just going to continue. Unfortunately, I think until just the Russians get what they're looking for there. I don't know how long that's going to take, but I can't see the Ukrainians achieving their objectives, which means I think it's more likely the Russians will achieve their objectives. And so that's just where we'll be. And we just have to hope in the meantime that things stay below the threshold of some kind of really terrible escalation. And of course, here domestically, doing everything possible that we can to make sure that Congress, that our individual congressional reps, like me, I call my reps several times a year to be like, don't support this. I hate this. Everyone in our community hates this. Don't do this. It's not much, but I know that all they care about is getting elected. And so if in the back of their mind, there's some doubt, like, should I be going along with this idea? Maybe I should voice a little opposition to it. No. So we just have to hope that things stay below the threshold there. And, it's a tragedy. It's obviously a tragedy, and it's really sad because it didn't need to happen. And, but yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be settled on the battlefield, ultimately. That's the harsh reality. With respect to the Israel-Gaza conflict, where do you think that's headed?
Oh, well, again, again, the United States could stop, Washington could stop it.
Could stop it.
I mean, both the Ukrainian war effort and the Israeli war effort are all entirely contingent upon Washington's support. And I know that people, supporters of Israel and Israeli politicians, they like to say, we don't need help from anyone. Like, the fact is they do.
Yeah.
The fact is they do. Like, granted, they fight and spill their own blood and stuff, but like, there's more to war than just blood. Like, there's money, there's weapons, there's intelligence cover, there's intelligence, there's a lot of different things that go into it. That being said, it looks like the continuation of the war will just be, sort of trying to herd the Palestinians further south, be able to push them out into the Sinai eventually to take all that land. Obviously, we've seen a lot of efforts to terrorize Palestinians in the West Bank. I mean, there's no pressure from Democrats or Republicans, really. You mentioned when the pro-Palestinian faction of the Democratic Party tried to speak out, they were shamed and hushed and silenced. And now the current administration is actively going after them on college campuses and things of that nature. It's unfortunate, of course, but I don't see any reason that Donald Trump would not continue to support Israeli policy in Gaza and in the West Bank. Obviously, Iran is a separate issue there. But no, I don't see any reason that's going to stop, unfortunately. And it seems like everything has just kind of been a token, been a cover. Like, if you remember that bridge, that floating bridge, that obvious publicity stunt that immediately collapsed, and it's all just been stuff where the United States could say, well, we don't like what they're doing. We wish they weren't doing this. We wish they'd be more careful with all these bombs we're giving them. But what can we do? And it's just going to continue. Yeah. So yeah, that's it. And, obviously there's a lot of possible X factors in the region. Obviously Israel has moved in and occupied part of southern Syria. Going to be very interesting to see what happens there. Obviously Turkey has interest there. Lot of possible conflict there. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point about separating the internal Israeli stuff from Iran, because I've been of the theory that from the jump, the whole Adelson money that Trump received was just like a naked quid pro quo for recognizing West Bank like annexation, because you mentioned the West Bank being terrorized. That's the thing that's being overlooked, that things could jump off there, and that's where a lot of the Israeli fanatics are frothing out the mouth over, because of Judea and Samaria. That's the real prize, because Gaza historically is not part of biblical Israel, but Judea and Samaria are, and like the West Bank is where I think a lot of people have to keep their eyes out, because if things kind of like get slowed down in Gaza, things could kick off there. Now, my final question here, this actually goes back to your point at the start of the interview that you called attention to with regards to the Houthi conflict. Ansar al-Allah, and how the U.S. got bogged down there because of like the U.S.'s apparent reversal in the Red Sea. Do you think that has made it less likely that the U.S. will carry out punitive strikes against Iran, especially its nuclear facilities?
Gosh. um I have long believed that the US just will not strike Iran's nuclear facilities. That's just not on the table. Israel, with US intelligence and permission and stuff, might do it, but I don't think that the United States is going to do it. Just look at US force deployment in the region. If the US were to bomb Iran, to bomb their facilities, it could lead immediately to pretty horrifying consequences for U.S. infrastructure, U.S. bases, U.S. fleet, U.S. lives. Like we have a lot of Washington has a lot of troops, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of hardware, a lot of troops, all well within Iranian missile striking distance. And this is just not something politically. I mean, if you did that and then the Iranians did that, now what are you going to do?
Yeah.
It's much safer for someone like Donald Trump to just say, okay, we couldn't get the Iranian, which I'm not even sure Trump would. I mean, I'm just saying theoretically, Trump says, okay, we couldn't get the deal done that I wanted. Go ahead and bomb them. That way, Trump has some deniability. And say, like, well, I did, the Israelis did it, which would not be awesome at all. But I just think that the likelihood of the United States doing that has always been very low because of U.S. force posture in the region and the likelihood of U.S. casualties. Views of Israel, even among Republicans, especially younger Republicans, is not terribly favorable anymore.
No, it's not. No, even among I saw like young white evangelicals, which I was shocked by. It's actually like tanking too among the younger crowd.
Exactly. And so if you were to do something like that and then trade American lives in a pretty obvious favor to Israel, like I don't know. I don't know how many American people could be convinced that that was a good trade. At this point. And Trump obviously is a political creature. He wants to get elected. he wants to maintain his popularity. I just don't think that that's the way that he would go about it. But Israel could obviously do it. Israel probably would love to do it. But we'll see. I think the Israeli willingness to do it is on the idea that if Iran were to respond, that the U.S. would respond on Israel's behalf. And so it's hard to know who's making what calculations and what would ultimately happen. I vote no one bomb anyone. That is the policy.
But even then, because I imagine that the Iranians see like Israel join at the hip with the U.S. and if Israel carried it out, could that still leave U.S. assets in the region at risk? Or I don't know. A lot of stuff is up in the air, in my opinion.
Yeah, it could. So, I mean, like I said, my preference is just for Iran to be left alone. It's 1930s. It's 1930s technology. Who cares if they have it or not? Israel has it.
Yeah.
Like, what are we even talking about here? It's not the end of the world. I'm not even sure Iran actually even needs it. Like, they have a latent nuclear deterrent. Like, they could make a bomb if they want to. Yeah. The reason that they don't need to is because Iran is basically uninvadable.
Yeah, it has really harsh topography. For sure.
Terrible topography. Yeah. It's thought Afghanistan thought Iraq was tough, or Afghanistan was tough. Take a look at Iran.
I mean, even with like the nuclear thing, I tell people this: like, if freaking Pakistan has nukes, then like pretty much any country can have like nukes at this juncture. So well, I think this is a good spot to bookmark this conversation, Joseph. But I really had a blast. Lots of thought-provoking insights on your part. Before we leave, like I do with my guests, feel free to plug away your content and some of your latest work.
Oh, thanks. Well, let's see. I write a weekly column at the Libertarian Institute. It's on Thursdays. Recently, I've been writing about Pakistan and India, actually. I teach a class on East Asia and India at Spring Arbor. And so when the most recent round of hostilities over Kashmir erupted, I thought, well, that's not something a lot of people have a lot of knowledge about. I'll do some articles about that. So did some of that. Over at the Mises Institute, I've been doing some work with Ryan McMakin on the work of Ralph Raico and the history of classical liberalism and different things like that. And then I'm working on a third book. Well, I'm still sort of doing kind of things and talks about the national debt and you, which is my most recent book, which I think is very timely because, again, we have this budget fight, this big bill, and what happens, the debt just keeps going up. And in the book, I make the case that the debt is ultimately unsustainable, that the U.S. should default, and that would be the best thing that we could have happen to us. Thinking about doing an updated version of the fake China threat because it's now 2 years old. But I have another project that I'm working on, which is a history of U.S. foreign policy in the latter half of the 19th century. So basically 1865 to 1898. It's just a very neglected period of U.S. foreign policy. And so I've been working on that. I'm about halfway done. So that's taking a lot of my time. I post videos of my lectures online on YouTube. That's about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your night to come onto the show, Joseph. And to my audience as well, thank you for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken. All right.